Matthew 27:46 says, "And about the ninth hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, as to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" This fourth statement from the cross. This fourth statement is pivotal to Calvary. For if you examine the first previous statements, they were made between 9 a.m. and noon while the sun was out. And Christ spoke those statements to other folk. To others, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." To others, he said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." To others, he said, "Woman, behold thy son. Son, behold thy mother." But now Jesus is transitioning from talking to other folk to now talking to his Father. But it's interesting because here it is, he does not use the term Father, but rather for the first time, Jesus invokes the term "my God" while he's on the cross. He opened up the dialogue on the cross with, "Father, forgive them." He closed the dialogue on the cross with, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." But now he's saying, "My God." And when he cries out at this time, it's interesting because it's noon, but yet it's midnight. Somebody's been there at the noon of your life, but yet it's midnight in your spirit. Jesus cries out and he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" It's interesting, and what a blessing it is, because scholars and theologians have debated this particular phrase from the cross, suggesting, some have said, that God turned his back on his son. Others have suggested that there's no way God could turn his back on himself. For in fact, when you look at John's gospel, John says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then later on in John's gospel, he invokes the idea and the perception that the Word became flesh, that is Emmanuel, and dwelled among us. So in fact, when we look at what Jesus is saying, he's not necessarily saying that God has turned his back on himself, because God cannot turn away from himself. But Jesus is saying, God, I need your help. As he cries to his Father in the midnight hour of his life, yet being noon, he gives us the idea of how to handle our midnight situations. He simply says, I've got to give this to God. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Jesus feels in his humanity all of the pain and all of the sorrow and all of the scourging that he's experienced. And now he's at a place and point where he's taken upon himself the sins of the world. But here it is that in the writer, it's simply suggestive in the next verse that others was yet there. He could hear those that were in the crowd, but he's looking for God. He could hear those that have scourged him, but he's looking for God. It is for you and I to understand today that as we deal with the midnights of our lives, although it might be noon in our lives, you're 30 years old, that's a noonday, but yet you could be going through a midnight. You're 50, that's noon, but you could be going through a midnight. That in fact, we ought to go to God and give it to God and be persistent in our prayer to God, knowing that God is a very present help in our times of trouble. This word will let you draw closer to God while you're facing your midnight, while it's noonday.
I've had many tears and sorrow. I've had questions for tomorrow. There've been times when I didn't know right from wrong. But in every situation, God gave me blessed consolation. And all my trials come to only make me strong. You see, I've been in a lot of places, and I've seen millions of faces. Sometimes I felt so all alone. But in my lonely hour, it became a precious lonely hour. Jesus reminded me I was his own. Let me tell you that, sing with me.
Through it all,
Through it all,
through it all,
oh, through it all, I've learned
to trust in Jesus.
to trust in Jesus.
I've learned
to trust in God. Through it all, God never failed me.
through it all.
He never let me down. I've learned
To depend
to depend upon His